Liz asked me to talk about three things today. First is, why is rebuilding financial stability a priority for the Federal Reserve and others in the United States? Secondly, what's driving financial vulnerability in the U.S.? And third, what are some innovative solutions, both research and policy, that we should be considering? And I do need to say that these are my own views and not necessarily the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis or the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Okay, first, confession. How many of you tune in to Hillary and David and watch Love It or List It? Pretty compelling, isn't it? Pretty exciting. You know, clearly there are millions of Americans who are enjoying rapidly rising home values, rising net worth, easy access to credit, low interest rates, generous government policies that's making it easier for them to build wealth. We in the U.S. were doing the same thing. We had quite a run there about 10 years ago. But then the bubble burst, and literally 2 decades of wealth and growth and income were erased. We lost, that's the blue line there, $16 trillion of wealth was lost in the United States. Nobody was spared, okay? Nobody was spared. I think everybody thought that the balance sheets of low and moderate and middle income families did not matter for overall economic performance until they did, right? The common view, including at the Federal Reserve, that what happens with the balance sheets and the homeownership values and the debts of low and moderate income families just doesn't matter. You know, that these things will work themselves out, that markets will take care of whatever problems were going on in the housing market. Clearly that view is wrong. The U.S. paid a huge price. We lost a lot of wealth, lost a lot of jobs. The Great Recession was, of course, the worst one that the U.S. had experienced since the Great Depression. Now, we have since recovered that wealth, but the recovery has been incredibly uneven. For the 1/4 of families who have stocks or stock market wealth as their primary asset, they have more than recovered their wealth. But for the 3/4 of families for whom homeownership is their primary asset, they are still recovering their wealth. They are still paying down their debts. All right? They are still struggling to make ends meet. And because of their struggles, because of their still trying to recover their wealth, the economy is still not performing as well as it could be. All right? We are still paying the price for families that had too much wealth and home ownership, financed with too much debt, and too little savings. I have many graphs I could have put up here that show the relationship between family net worth and economic performance. This is just one. As you can see on this graph, if you look at the shaded area, there is a very clear and very powerful inverse relationship between family net worth and unemployment. Okay, when net worth goes down, unemployment goes up, and vice versa. Now, the correlation, of course, is just a correlation that there's actually a couple of channels through which economic performance is hurt when family net worth goes down. One's called wealth effects, and that's basically how do families spend differently when their home values or their stock values go up or down. Okay, there's an effect when you, the wealth effect, you know, predicts whether or not you're going to spend more or less. And the second channel is something called deleveraging, which in this room, I'm sure you know what that is, but it's basically paying down or shedding your debts. And this was also quite powerful in harming the economy. The couple of economists, Sufi and Mian, found out that 2 out of every 3 jobs lost between 2007 and 2009 were directly related to household deleveraging. They're too busy paying down debts to be engaged in the economy, all right? So it's not surprising that my boss at the Federal Reserve, President Jim Bullard, and many other economists called our recession a balance sheet recession, all right? So in response, the St. Louis Fed, with the support and guidance of the Board of Governors, created the Center for Household Financial Stability a few years ago. And our purpose is to research family balance sheets to both strengthen families and the economy. This center would not have existed 5 or 10 years ago. Nobody thought that we needed something like this. They certainly didn't think that we needed it for macroeconomic performance. And what's interesting here, and this is something that Liz mentioned and Adam mentioned as well, the framework is no longer just asset building. It's your debts, too. It's the entire balance sheet. So we make a point of talking about the entire balance sheet as an analytical and conceptual framework for the work that we're trying to do. And another key difference is that we are trying to be proactively monitoring family balance sheets, not reacting to balance sheet failures. One of the ways that we're going to do that is through something called a balance sheet index. Many of you might be familiar in the U.S. with the Case-Shiller Housing Index. We plan to do something like that, but for family balance sheets, so that we have a barometer of what's going on in low-income and low-wealth communities as a sign for what might be happening in the broader economy. All right? Now, some of the research that we've produced at the Federal Reserve is trying to get at the drivers. This is the second part of the talk. What's driving financial vulnerability in the U.S.? We put out a series of reports very recently called The Demographics of Wealth. And we've put out 4 reports so far. And we're tending not to really look at income as a way to cut the data because it's very volatile, as I'll talk about in a minute. We looked at these very stable and increasingly powerful drivers of financial vulnerability, in particular, one's age or birth year, secondly, race or ethnicity, and third, your education. And it turns out that, in fact, these are the 3 strongest predictors of financial well-being in the United States. So, you know, in other words, these demographic drivers are increasingly determine who builds wealth and who does not. And we've kind of split it up into 2 groups. We have what we call thrivers, which is roughly 1 in 4 Americans who are the very high bars on this chart here, who are better educated, older, and white or Asian. You know, these are the ones who I mentioned earlier have more than recovered their wealth and are actually doing quite well. But then you have 3 out of 4 what we call strugglers, and these are the lower bars here. And they, I should go back, the thrivers, having these demographic features serves as a tailwind. It makes it easier for them to build wealth. But for the strugglers, the 3 and 4 Americans, the lower bars, you know, these demographic features being younger, being less educated, and being either black or Hispanic or Native American, these serve as headwinds. It's harder to build wealth because you have these demographic features, all right? And it's the strugglers who, not surprisingly, are the ones who are still rebuilding their wealth, still deleveraging, and still not fully engaged in the economy. As a matter of fact, we've documented in another report that there's been a huge shift away from strugglers and towards thrivers in just 1 generation. Massive. Again, and this is a contributor to growing wealth inequality in the U.S. We have both an income and a wealth inequality problem in the U.S., but the wealth inequality problem is far more significant, and I would argue far more consequential. All right. So another key contributor to growing financial vulnerability in the U.S. is increasing income and expense volatility, basically the ups and downs in people's financial lives. There have been 2 major studies along these lines. The first is the Us Financial Diaries, which actually interviewed about 300 families in 5 cities over the course of 2 or 3 years. Researchers actually went into their living rooms to really, granularly understand what's going on in their financial lives. And then the second one was something that J.P. Morgan Chase put out through their new institute called Weathering Volatility. And their data was simply their, millions of customers. They mined their data to see what they can learn about how families are managing their finances. There are 3 big takeaways, I think, from both reports. First is that there are more and more families are increasing both spikes in income and spikes in expenses, and these are not conveniently timed together. So when your income goes up doesn't mean when your expenses go up, all right? So more and more families are having these ups and downs in their financial lives. Second, while it is a problem, bigger problem for lower income families, This is a problem that is pervading the U.S. middle class. It's becoming a normal part of life for many, many families. All right, nobody is really being spared unless you're very wealthy, although even some wealthier families are having some challenges too. And the third big takeaway is that families do not have sufficient savings to meet these shortfalls. They just don't have the money. They don't have enough savings to smooth out their consumption. And as a matter of fact, the Federal Reserve put out a study recently showing that fully 1/2 of all families could not meet a $400 unexpected expense. They either would not pay it, they would borrow, or they would have to sell something. Half of all Americans, folks, we're talking about, can't even meet a $400 expense, all right? So let me go to the third part of my talk and shift to kind of the innovative research and policies that are responding to growing financial insecurity and growing inequality in the U.S. You know, what's actually having an impact in the U.S. So I'm going to do a very brief guided tour of some of the big things going on in the U.S. And some of you are probably familiar with this work, so I apologize if you are. So the first is this idea that place matters, and I think place matters more than we thought in determining who moves up the economic ladder and who does not. There's a big study by economist Raj Chetty and his team. They produce, using big data, tax data, they produced what's called a heat map. And basically what this shows is the likelihood of a child born in the bottom 20% of the income distribution moving all the way to the top 20% as an adult. What's the likelihood of that happening? As you can see, and so the darker areas means they have a lower probability of moving up. The lighter areas, they have a higher probability of moving up. I think there are two key takeaways from this graph. First is, as you can see, there is enormous variation in economic mobility across the U.S., right? I mean, as a matter of fact, in the places where economic mobility is the worst, the rates match the worst countries in the developed world. In the places where economic mobility is highest, they match the best rates in the developed world. We have enormous variation, like 3 times difference between the lowest and the highest. And you know, to me, this is, in many ways, this is good news. So national policy does matter, but I think for those of you working on the local level, working on the poverty reduction strategy, making grants to folks at the local level, this is where the levers are. You know, you can do a lot more good than we thought by changing the context and changing conditions in local areas. I find that very encouraging. The second big takeaway that Chetty and his team found is that the earlier a child is exposed to a better neighborhood, either by improving the neighborhood or by moving to a better one, the more likely that child is to move up the economic ladder. Okay, so earlier is better. All right? So if there's time later, I'm happy to go through what predicts who moves up and who doesn't, but I'll move on for now. So Raj Chetty and his team are not the only ones coming to the conclusion that earlier is better, that if we want to make a difference on inequality, on poverty, on financial security, we have to make investments earlier in life than we thought. The first is the asset building field, the family balance sheet field. Where there's a whole body of research from Trina Williams and Willie Elliott, many others, Michael Sheridan, of course, showing that, you know, even very small amounts of savings and small amounts of assets earlier in life can have even a transformative effect on the life course. You don't necessarily have to have a lot of assets in order to make a difference, but the earlier you have those assets, the better. The second is James Heckman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist. If you see the graph there on the, I guess it's on your left, it's a chart here showing what are the returns on human capital if you make human capital investments. And it's really, you know, it's pretty obvious. The earlier in life you make the investments, the bigger the return, both to the family and to the economy. As a matter of fact, prenatal investments have a far bigger impact than investments made when somebody is just entering the workforce. So earlier is better. And then the final scholar is Robert Putnam of Bowling Alone fame, who has a new book out called Our Kids. And Putnam's talking and very worried about what he calls a new class divide, not race divide, but a new class divide. And here the issue is it's between the 1/3 of families whose parents are A, college educated, and B, married. Okay, they're doing great. He calls those rich kids. Okay, but then there's up to 2/3 of families where the parent is either not married, the parents are not married, and they're not college educated. He calls those poor kids. And there is an enormous class divide, and he's got 30 charts showing this on various measures, this growing divide simply based on whether or not your parents are married or educated. And not surprisingly, he also calls for a broad range of very early investments in life to close this gap. As a matter of fact, I think kind of the big finding that I'm seeing is that whatever inequality you are working on, whether it's income or wealth or education, reading, those inequalities, the seeds of those inequalities are planted early in life, and many of the patterns are set by age 5. All right, that doesn't mean we give up on people after that, but if you want to have the biggest impact, you have to do it early in life. All right? So I want to pose a question here. Does financial education matter? And yes, it does. And congratulations to TD and the government for their investments in financial education. But I think we're learning that if you only do traditional financial education, you're not going to have quite the impact that you would like to have. And I think in the U.S., there's sort of a bigger shift going on. It's from financial education to this concept of financial capability and moving towards financial well-being, which Adam talked about a little bit earlier. And basically, you can describe it this way. It's going from what you know to what you do with what you know to what you achieve with what you do, all right? And that's the big shift in thinking in the U.S. And I think, and in the U.S., financial well-being is becoming a very common framework. I was pleased to hear about that in Canada, too. And so there's 2 books that have come out that I think, and there are many others that I think are really worth mentioning. One is by Cass Sunstein, who co-wrote Nudge many years ago. And his book is called Choosing Not to Choose. For music fans, you probably know that Cass Sunstein is just basically, he wrote a book about something the rock band Rush wrote about many years ago. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. Who remembers that line? That's what I thought. Okay. Well, it's all about context. You don't make choices absent context. And whatever the context is, an employer default mechanism or redesigning a form, these things have a huge impact on how people do financially. This is probably not news to you, but it's still news to a lot of folks in the U.S. and to many policymakers. And the second book, of course, is Scarcity, which Eldar Shafir will talk about in a few minutes. And I don't have to say much about that, other than, he makes this big insight that I think is great, which is that poverty is not the result of poor choices, it's the other way around, all right? Poor choices is the result of poverty. Let me just mention a couple of promising policies, and then I'll wrap up. Even though there's a lot we need to do, retirement security, education, student loans, there's a million things we all need to do. In the U.S., I think 2 policies have particular promise. One is to create emergency savings and rainy day funds that Liz talked about. This is a little humbling for those who've been in the field for many years, because we started off with this idea that poor people need long-term assets. You need a home, you need a retirement account, you need a college education, and you were penalized if you tried to save for short-term emergencies. But in experiments, 2/3 of all families who had individual development accounts took unmatched withdrawals, gave up a 2-to-1 match because they needed the money to cover some sort of a shortfall. Well, now almost all of the field is thinking, we still care about the longer-term stuff, but we realize the way to get to the longer-term stuff is to meet the financial needs of families in the shorter term. This is partly because of the rise in volatility, but it's also, there's a lot of other reasons. And I think of all the things that we can be doing for struggling families, emergency saving cuts across the health of the balance sheet. You can reduce your reliance on payday lenders. You have a cushion. If there's an emergency, you can start to make the longer term investment. So we've put a lot of thought lately into how can we leverage employers, the tax time moment, and technology in order to generate emergency savings. And we have a new product called the MyRA, which I think is a retirement product, but has also some very attractive short-term features. And then the second big idea, which I know you're all familiar with, is the savings accounts either at birth or when kids enter kindergarten. In the U.S., these started as lifelong accounts. They've become, the momentum is around college savings accounts. And we don't have national policy yet like you guys do, but we have a lot of exciting state and local policies that are taking off all over the U.S. And in these states, they're seated with either $50 or $100 or $500, again, with a college focus. And the big shift here is to move from an opt-in strategy to an opt-out. Your frigid neighbors up in Maine had a 39% uptake rate on their universal at birth 529 college savings account. 2 years ago, they switched to an opt-out, and now they have 100% participation. And I should point out, too, that this is a fabulous tool for teaching financial basics. One of the big learnings, I think, in the field is that when you offer financial education with an account that a child owns and manages, the outcomes are much better. So let me close with just a question that Liz asked me to address. Is larger scale systems change possible? There are 2 books out. One looking back and one looking forward that believe that the answer is, in fact, yes. So I happen to write one and have a chapter in another, so maybe that's my view of things. So forgive the self-promotion here. But going back, this book I wrote with Phil Longman, The Next Progressive Era, was basically looking at America's progressive era in history. Started in about 1890, went till about 1930. And what was striking to us as writers was how similar the world was then versus what it is today. You know, gaping inequality, a banking system in crisis, massive consolidation among corporations, widespread predatory lending. And I think, and yet what they achieved was nothing short of stunning in terms of the policy reforms and the changes they made. And I think our view is if they could do it, we can do it too. And you know, Mark Twain once said that history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And there are many of us in the U.S. who hope that's the case. And then the final book is coming out on December 8th. It's called What It's Worth. And it's strengthening the financial future of families, communities, and the nation. I have an essay digging deeper into these demographic drivers, but what the book is really about is that we have to move away from standalone boutique asset building or financial empowerment programs. That the way to get scale is to integrate financial capability into a broad range of programs, you know, that are reaching more and more struggling Americans. Public health systems, education systems, environmental programs. You know, this is the big trend. And so this book is all about how do you foster integration to both increase impact and increase scale. So with that, I really appreciate your time and appreciate the invitation and look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.